The morning draped him Morey Hall in a timeless autumn mist, as if the Devonshire countryside had slumbered for centuries. The Georgian manor, nestled among rolling hills, stood proud yet remote, its ivy-clad facade and lattice windows catching the soft light, its circular driveway crunched under the wheels of arriving cars, heralding today's event, the reading of Sir Lionel Edgcomb's will. 3 months after the patriarch's death, delayed by probate complications, the Edgcombe family and select guests gathered in the great hall where Sir Lionel once held sway. The house hummed with life. Trunks thudded against polished floors, kitchen staff bustled, and long sealed doors creaked open as guests claimed rooms untouched for years. At the center stood Lady Eugenia Edgcombe, tall and sharp-featured, her severity softened by time into something cold resignation, perhaps, or weariness. "Mrs. Hargreaves," she said crisply to the housekeeper, "ensure the blue room is prepared for Mr. Montague. He despises the east wings, says it gives him chills." "Yes, my lady," Mrs. Hargreaves murmured, bowing before vanishing up the servants' stairwell. By late morning, the guests arrived. First was Gerald Montague, a solicitor whose face seemed allergic to smiles, known more for discretion than courtroom flair. He had handled Sir Lionel's obscure affairs, arriving with a briefcase and an unneeded umbrella under a cloudless sky. Then came Clarissa Edgcombe, Sir Lionel's youngest granddaughter, heralded by the chime of silver bracelets and French perfume. Radiant yet aloof, her mourning black dress, more Parisian than Reverend hinted, had beauty wielded like currency. Behind her trailed her half-brother, Peter Edgcombe, 35, with pinched features and nervous eyes. A man of too many cigarettes and too much drink, his once promising reputation now teetered between disreputable and tragic. Others followed. Marcus Vane, a family friend with vague business dealings abroad. Agatha Cray, Lady Eugenia's widowed cousin, ever on the cusp of scandalous remarks. And Miss Joan Tilling, Sir Lionel's former secretary, plain and mouse-like, lingering in doorways, speaking only when addressed. As they gathered in the drawing room, the air thickened with muted greetings, forced smiles, and the delicate clink of crystal. Each guest a thread in the intricate tapestry of secrets about to unravel, of china cups on saucers, the fireplace unlit, reflected only silence. At noon, Gerald Montague stood before them all with the quiet gravity of a man who knew the value of a pause. He opened his briefcase with a slow theatrical movement and withdrew the will I shall read aloud, the final testament of Lionel Edgcombe, he said, dated March 7th of this year. No one spoke. Clara softened her legs and examined her manicure. Peter looked into his teacup as if it might hold answers. The reading was sought. First, uneventful bequests to Long Irving Staffa, donation to a local library, several minor paintings given to a museum. Then came the inheritance of the estate itself. Hire hall to my grandson, Peter Lionel Edgcombe Montague. Read aloud. I leave the entirety of the estate with the condition that he not sell or divide the land for a period of 5 years. There was a sharp intake of breath. Clarissa sat up straight. Agatha Cray raised an eyebrow. Peter looked stunned. My granddaughter, Clarissa Elise Edgcombe Montague, continued. I leave their remainder of my liquid assets, approximately £65,000 in trust, until her 30th birthday. Clarissa made a sound, not quite a gasp, but certainly not approval. Lady Eugenia remained still, her lips pursed into a line so thin it could have been a seam. Then, just as Montague was about to fold the paper, he hesitated. There is an addendum, he said. All eyes turned to him in the event of any dispute arising over the contents of this. Will he read slowly? The mirror. Rumors to remain sealed until the rightful heir is confirmed by legal or moral means. There was a silence, the kind of silence that has a pulse. The mere room. Agatha Cray said, finally, her voice like crushed velvet. Why, that room's been locked for years, ever since Lionel's brother hanged himself. And there, Lady Eugenia's teacup, shattered on the floor, it was perhaps the only genuine sound of the afternoon outside the wind. Shifted, ruffling the hedges with the idle fingers of something ancient and far away, or very near a car engine leaped. A few minutes later, a figure emerged through the wrought iron gates. Off Highmire Hall, walking upright and precise, a single suitcase in one hand and a hat, perfectly centered, atop a head of impeccable grooming, Hercule Poirot had arrived. His mustache gleamed. With pomade his gray eyes missed nothing, and his expression suggested that even without knowing what had occurred, he already suspected that something quite troubling had been set into motion. And as he paused at the foot of the stone steps, he tilted his head ever so slightly toward the manor. He murmured, then he entered chapter to the room. No, in and tiered the air inside. Highmire Hall shifted when Hercule Poirot crossed the threshold, as though the building itself sensed the arrival of something, or someone utterly alien to its secrets. Lady Eugenia met him in the entrance hall, her expression composed, but her eyes weary. A butler hovered near, beyond certain whether to offer assistance or retreat. Monsieur Poirot, she said, with the fondest curtsy. Thank you for coming on such short notice, though I confess am unsure whether your presence is necessary. Poole bowed, slightly removing his hat with deliberate elegance. Madame, one is never entirely certain on necessity until after the fact. I come at the request of your late spawn solicitor, Ms. Montague, will I understand, has caused unpadded commotion. Lips tightened. Some family members were displeased, but wills often have that effect, do they not? Poole gave a gentle smile. Indeed, they are like mirrors, madame. They reflect much that was hidden in life. Lady Eugenia did not smile back. He was shown to a guest room with a view over the gardens, impeccably furnished with a writing desk, a narrow fireplace, and wallpaper of faded gold. Poole took only a moment to freshen up, laying out his shaving brush and aligning his two pairs of shoes side by side, as though in conversation. When he returned to the main floor, the guests were still in the drawing room, some engaged in the delicate art, half pretending they hadn't been arguing moments before. Peter Edgecombe stood near the hearth, nursing a drink, far too early in the day. Clarissa sat by the window, ankle crossed over knee in a way it's too modern for the house's taste, staring through the glass with eyes that didn't blink often enough. Gerald Montague, the solicitor, stood stiffly in the corner, papers now neatly tucked away. Monsieur Madame's Poirot said softly, but the room quieted all the same. May I ask, where is this room mentioned in the will? The mirror room. We ain't. Silence passed between them, thin and strange. A room with a secret name in a house full of ancient ones always created this calm. Peter cleared his throat. It's in the west wing. It's been locked up for 20 years. Quoi? Pray? Asked Poirot, eyebrows raised. Lady Eugenia's ward from the threshold. Because that room is cursed. Mia Poirot, my husband's brother, Jonathan Edgecombe, hanged himself there in 1909. He had a troubled mind. Leonel sealed the room after it happened. No one has entered since. Was there errors in the will? Referenced it now after so long? Poirot asked. His tone was polite, but his words held teeth, so Lionel believed the room held symbolic value. Said Montague carefully. He told me once that truth reveals itself where false reflections are banished. Cryptic, but so is he. Poole blinked once slowly. And no one has entered since. No one. Lady Eugenia confirmed. Then I should very much like to see this room. Lady Eugenia stiffened. I'm not sure that's wise. It's dusty, abandoned, and of no relevance, but perhaps. Poirot interrupted gently. It is. West wing was colder, the air dry and untouched, like breathless memory. They ascended the main staircase and turned left down a corridor with faded portraits and cracked sconces. Poirot followed Montague and Peter, while Clarissa trailed behind, arms folded, lips pursed in vague amusement. At the end of the hallway stood a heavy wooden door, tall and darged, its keyhole blackened with age. It had no sign, no plaque, and no visibly handle. "This is it," Peter murmured. "Have you the key?" Poirot asked. Montague produced a brass one from his inner coat pocket. Sir Lionel gave it to me 5 years ago. Told me to guard it. Poole accepted it carefully, almost reverently. The key clicked once, then again. A hesitant turner, reluctant bolt. Then the door opened. The mirror room. At first, it was hard to tell what made the room so strange. Its layout was ordinary, square and modest, with 3 shuttered windows and a grand chandelier choked in cobwebs. But the mirrors, they vary where each wall was covered in them. Tall mirrors, oval mirrors, beveled and chipped, some cracked, others pristine. Their frames were mismatched, gilded iron, rosewood, and bronze. A vanity stood in one corner, its mirror shattered into precise triangular shards. A cheval mirror stood by the window, its surface dustless despite the rest of the room's decay. Pua stepped inside. The air was dry and slightly perfumed, like old powder. He turned slowly, examining the room through its own reflections. "Sit. Range," he murmured. "A room built for vanity, or perhaps for interrogation." Lady Eugenia remained in the doorway, arms crossed like a sentry. "Do you know," Poole said softly, "in some cultures, mirrors are covered after a death to prevent the soul from becoming trapped within." Clarissa scoffed faintly. "Superstitions. This family has enough aptos." Poole crouched, his gaze narrowing on the floor beneath. The cheval mirror withdrew a white handkerchief and dusted the part gently. A scratch along deliberate gouge in the wood, recent, and yet, Poirot said quietly, "This floor was marked not 24 hours ago." Peter's face blanched. "Impossible." Lady Eugenia said sharply, "No one has a key but Mr. Montague." Poirot stood. "Then, perhaps, someone has been trespassing." He turned suddenly, decisive. "Seal the room again. Romantic. No one is to enter it again until I say otherwise." Montague nodded. Rattled. The door closed with a long, reluctant groan. Q looked back on Cease, lingering on the mirrors, as though they were watching him too. That ninth house was restless. Clarissa was heard arguing with Peter on the upstairs landing. Miss Tilling sat in her room, reading an old letter by candlelight, her eyes wide and unblinking. And in the drawing room, Poirot sat with a single glass of cream, Tiant placing objects on the table before him: a pair of gloves, a hairpin, a half-burned match, and a tiny silver bell he had quietly retrieved from the vanity in the mirror room. He said nothing, but his eyes were sharp. Then he looked up and murmured to himself, "It has begun." Chapter 3. A Death Behind Reflections. The morning light fell harsh and pale across deferent lawns of Higher Hall, turning the dew into glittering needles inside a weaver. The day began not with elegance, but with a scream. It echoed from the west wing, slicing through the manor silence like a knife. Poole, already dressed sedan, adjusting his cravat, paused. Midnight. A single glance at his pocket watch. 7:42 a.m. He was already halfway down the corridor when a housemaid, Bill's linen and shaking, stumbled into view. From the staircase leading down from the servants' passage, her apron was spotted with something dark. It's clutched to banister, gasping. "In the mirror room, sir," she whispered. "Oh God, oh, it's terrible." Poirot did not run. He never did, but his stride was swift and precise by its time. Lady Eugenia arrived, wrapped in a robe of gray silk, and Peter in rumpled trousers and an undone collar. The hall outside the sealed room was already filling with bodies' faces full of confusion and fear. "Who unlocked the door?" Eugenia snapped. "It was sealed. I did not open it." Gerald Montague said, breathless, coming up behind them. "The key is still with me. See?" He held it up. Trembling. Poole said nothing. He simply pointed. The mirror room door was open, swung wide, but ajar, as though it had merely been nudged by an unseen hand. Cold draught whispered through the crack like breath from a crypt. Poole pushed it open fully and stepped inside. The sight was grotesque, but still. There was no violence, not in the traditional sense. The body of Miss Joan Tilling sat, slumped at the vanity head, bowed over the shattered mirror. Her hands rested on the table perfectly, placed as though in prayer. Her lips were parted just slightly, and her eyes, her widened blinking eyes, stared into nothing in her lap. A page from a book had been folded twice, then unfolded its creases, suggesting great care on it. A single sentence, in delicate curving ink: "We all carry reflections, but some we should not see." Poirot crouched beside her, his gloved fingers brushing her wrist. Cold, murmured stiffness setting in. "She has been dead for 2 hours. Perhaps dead, Lady Eugenia," whispered Hand. At her throat, Clarissa stepped forwardly, expression unreadable. "But why would she be in here at all? She never wandered." The housebetter's voice cracked. Did she poison herself? There's no blood, no sign of anything horrible." Poirot stood there. "It's not blood, monsieur, because this was not violence of rage. It was violence of design." He gestured to the room. The mirrors, once merely eerie, now seemed to watch them all with impassive cruelty. Reflected Jones, still formed from a different angle, distorting her posture, multiplying her death pool. Turned sharply to Montague. "The door, you say, it remained locked?" Montague nodded. "I swear it. Q. The key was in my possession the entire night. I never even left my room." "And yet," Poirot said, turning toward the heavy latch, "the door shows no signs of being forced, no scratches, no bruising. The bolt remains clean. It was opened from within, or someone had another key." Peter looked at Clarissa, who was staring at the note. "She wasn't the kind to write riddles," Clarissa said softly. "Joan was plain and dull, kind, but timid. She never stirred anything. She simply watched Poirot move to the vanity, examining the objects. A Kamba silver bell, missing a bottle of rosewater, a single drawer, slightly open inside it, a photograph, black and white, slightly faded. It showed a much younger Joan, perhaps 20, standing beside a man in a military uniform. Poirot study K image. The man's face was turned slightly away, but the uniform bore a distinctive emblem Hastings would recognize. "This Huro," murmured to himself, "regiment from Sussex, 1917, perhaps. Does it mean something?" asked Montague. "Everything means something," Poirot replied. "Even silence, even dust." The local constabulary arrived an hour later, summoned by the butler at Poirot's request. Inspector Flint was a man with a nose for whiskey and a patience level that rarely survived past breakfast. Still, he respected Pooh. "Inauto, stay quiet." While the detective recounted the scene, no signs of a struggle. Pooh concluded, no screams, no returned objects, and yet his tilling is dead. Suicide. Flint offered pill, perhaps Pew shook his head. No glass, no residue in the positioning to stage Dethoffen. Leaves the body disarranged. This is performance. Inspector Flint looked around at the mirror's creepy place. Gives me the shakes. Pooh looked a day game at the central mirror, the one behind Joan's body, and narrowed his easiest small fingerprint just above, where a hand might rest for balance, a left hand small. Likely a woman's. Poirot straightened. "I must speak to every guest alone, one by one, and hide. We'll ask you off. Same question." "What question is that?" asked Lady Eugenia. Poirot's gazetted, not waver. "What do you see when you look in the mirror?" The silence that followed was different now. No longer just discomfort. It was fear. Chapter 4, The Secrets in the Glass of Rue. Poirot's request was not up for debate. One by one, the residents and guests of Highmere Hall were summoned to the study, a dim, wood-paneled room near the back of the house that smelled faintly of tobacco, old parchment, and dessous. A single, green-shaded lamp lit the desk, casting shadows that turned faces into masks. Poirot sat in a high back, chair legs precisely crossed, a small notepad beside him, though he rarely wrote anything down. Inspector Flint stood silently in the corner, arms crossed, offering no commentary, but watching every flicker of discomfort. Like a hawk circling above us, field Athenas, the first to enter, was Peter Edgecombe. He looked rumpled, shaken. Emmanuel had once worn his wealth like a badge, and now wore disappointment like asking, "Please, monsieur," Poirot said. gesturing to the chair opposite him. "This will not take long, unless it must." Peter sank into the chair like a marionette with severed strings. "Did you know Miss Joan Tillingwell Poirot?" began fingers, gently tapping his knee. Peter rubbed his jaw. "Not especially, she was skeet. Never interfered. I don't even remember her being invited. She was Sir Lionel's secretariat. Is logical. She would be present for the will." Peter nodded, eyes flickering toward the fireplace. "And what do you see?" "Coup," said suddenly. "When you look in the mirror." Peter blinked. "I don't follow Cumino, monsieur. In the morning, when you shave, when you pass a hallway, mirror what? Looks back at you." Peter paused. "A man, I hardly recognize it now." Poirot said nothing. Peter shifted. "Look, if you're implying I had something to do with her death, I imply nothing," Poirot replied gently. "But I noticed everything, including the faint scent of whiskey on your breath at 8 o'clock in the morning." Peter flinched, then stood instant. "All for now." Clarissa Edgecombe entered next, trailing expensive, perfumed insolence. "Honestly," she said, flopping into the chair, "I find all of this a bit overblown." The woman was miserable. "Perhaps Shekel didn't take it any more, miss. Tilling did not strike me as desperate," Poirot replied, "but I will entertain all theories. Tell me, mademoiselle, what do you see when you look in the mirror?" Clarisse arched an eyebrow. "My reflection, naturally, and I like what I see." Pura smiled faintly. "Confidence can be both armor and weapon. Do you recall what Miss Tilling was doing yesterday? Was she with anyone?" "She hovered near the drawing room most of the afternoon," Clarissa replied. "She watched people." "She always watched. I wouldn't be surprised if she knew more, about us than we knew about her." Poirot nodded. "And what about the mirror room? Have you ever entered it before?" "Yesterday." Clarissa frowned. "Not once. It was practically legend. We used to dare each other to get close to it as children." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And you never wondered what was inside?" Clarissa's lips curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "Of course I wondered, but some doors are better left shut." Monsieur Pouet raised a brow. "And yet now it is open one by one." Others were brought in. Lady Eugenia insisted she hadn't left her room until she heard the scream. She claimed no fondness for Joan Tilling and no quarrel with Kerr either. When asked about her own reflection, she replied flatly, "I see what's left of a woman who once mattered." Marcus Finn, the business associate, spoke quickly and nervously. He admitted to wandering the halls late at night, insomnia, he claimed, but swore never approached the mirror room. When asked about mirrors, he said, "They make me uneasy, always have, like they're waiting for you to blink." Agatha Cray, flamboyant and sharp-tongued, leaned into the question. "I see who I used to be," she said, smiling ruefully, "and I never liked her much. But darling, who among us truly does?" Montague, the solicitor, kept his answers clipped. He denied unlocking the mirror room when asked about Tilling. He hesitated. "She once confided in me," he said, finally, "years ago, something about the house. But I didn't press. She was too timid to ever say it out loud." Pooh narrowed his eyes in the mirror room. "What is your opinion?" "I think Sir Lionel kept it locked because it scared him," Montague said. "But I also think it reminded him of something that Winnie Pooh walked alone through the west. Hang, candle in hand, shadows dancing in the cracked wallpaper." He paused before the mirror room. Now resealed with Montague's key, his reflection met his gaze. In the beveled surface of the seal veil, mirror distorted slightly off-center, he turned to the scratched floorware. Joan had sat down to the photograph he now carried in his pocket. The man beside Joan in the image had been identified by Hastings via telegram as Captain Thomas Rogg, deceased in 1918. A brief obituary noted his connection to the Edgecombe estate. He hadn't been engaged to Lady Eugenia's younger sister. That sister, Poirot learned, had died of pneumonia or heartbreak, a thread a faint one. But Poirot, unlike many, understood that the faintest threads often pulled open the deepest truths. Back in his room, he reviewed the timeline of the morning's discovery: the screen, the unlocked door, the folded note, the missing bell, the fingerprint. Closed room, A woman who should not have had access a death too neat to be accidental. And then the reflection. The clue that had not yet spoken Pua lit as a canned candle, placing it beside a mirror in his room. He looked at his own face, then at the space. Behind him, his eyes narrowed. Something had moved. Chapter 5. The Red Reflection. By the following morning, the tone at Heimer Hall had shifted from aristocratic discomfort to something closer to dread. Breakfast was served in uneasy silence. The clink of cutlery on porcelain seemed louder than usual. No one mentioned Miss Tilling directly, but her absence sat at the table like a ghost. Poirot did not attend to breakfast. He was already pacing the mirror room. The door had once Gambian locked by Montague, but Poirot had requested it be reopened early that morning. The detective moved slowly through a prill, a teen, the room, noting how the light bent differently through each pane of glass. One mirror warped reflections, slanting them. Another darkened the edges, creating a halo of shadow around the viewer. But it was the she-old mirror, the standing one, that held his attention. It had been repositioned ever so slightly. Last night Poirot had mentally marked the angle, noting how it reflected the chandelier. Now it reflected feet away. Someone had touched it, moved it. He crouched once more at the base of it and drew out a measuring tape. The Kent carried not for utility, but for truth. 2 and to the right, he murmured, "Why hast it?" and faced it behind him in the reflection. He saw the room's wall through wooden paneling, the fractured vanity mirror, and then, behind his own silhouette, something else, a faint square knot. Light, not shadow, a difference in texture, barely perceptible. He turned quickly. The wall was smooth, but Poirot did not trust smoothness. He stepped to Thepno and knocked a hollow echo. There is a hidden panel, he thought, but why conceal it? And why in a room sealed for decades? He did not force it open. Not yet. Poirot believed in the theater of timing. Later that morning, Inspector Flint summoned Poirot to the library. "We've interviewed the staff again," Flint said, voice low. "And there's something odd. The maid who discovered Miss Tilling said she saw a flash of red in the room just before she screamed." "Red?" Poirot asked, taking a seat in one of the worn leather chairs. "She said it was a flutter of red cloth, like a scarf or a dress. But when we checked the room, there was no red object anywhere near the body." Poirot leaned back, fingers stippled. "Interesting, Miss Kaelin was dressed in pale gray, nothing red in her attire." Flint scratched his beard. "You think someone else was in there just before the scream?" Pooh didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to the library's polished brass fire guard reflecting the room like a distorted mirror. "It may be," he said. At last, that colored red was not part of the room. It was a reflection from outside. It had gloomy, understood. Flint looked puzzled. "So what now?" Pooh stood. "Now we speak to Clarissa." Clarissa's Edgecombe's room was an elegant corner, suite filled with travel trunks and perfume bottles. When Poirot entered, she was painting her nails, a deep burgundy red. She barely looked up. "Come to ask me again what I see in the mirror is your..." Poirot ignored the question. "You on a red silk scarf," he said, his tone like a scalpel. "Do you wear it often?" Clarissa raised one brow. "Sometimes. Why, it is missing from your wardrobe." She stopped painting. "You went through my wardrobe." "I observed it, mademoiselle. I observe many things, more than most would find comfortable." Clarissa set the nail brush down. "Fine. I wore it yesterday evening when I went for a walk in the garden. It was chilly." "And did you pass near the West Wing?" She narrowed her eyes. "Possibly. I don't mark my strolls like a timidable." Pooh nodded slowly and afterward. "I came back changed, had a drink with Peter in the drawing room." "At what time?" 9:30 perhaps." "Why does it matter?" Pooh stepped closer. "Because the maid who found Stilling's body reported seeing a flutter of red just before she screamed." Clara's expressions remained frozen, but her eyes flicked left the subtlest tick of nerves. "I don't know what you saw," Clarissa said coolly, "but I wasn't near that room. If you think a scarf makes me a murderer, you're dreaming." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, mademoiselle, a scarf is not a weapon, but it is a thread, and threads lead somewhere." He turned to leave, but paused. At the door, "Oh, and one more thing," said, without looking back. "Be careful with mirrors sometimes. They reflect more than the face." That evening, Poirot returned to the mirror room alone. He stood before the wall panel, again, vengefully pressed his fingers. Along the wood's edge there, a soft indentation, a catch, with a soft click. A small square of paneling slid open, revealing a hollow space. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, lay a bundle of documents, letters. He carried them to the vanity, brushing aside a dusted hairbrush. He read the first letter. "Dearest Joan, I cannot go on pretending they think I don't remember, but I do. I saw what Clarissa did. I saw what she became, and if Sir Lionel hadn't hushed it, there would have been scandal beyond reckoning. I kept the mirror room closed because of what it shows and what it hides." Signed simply, La Apu Fold Deathy. Letter, slowly, then opened. The second, a different hand, but unmistakable. She said she'd expose me if I went near the room, that it held the truth. But truth is a sharp thing, and no Deverian survives the cut. If anything happens, know this, it wasn't meant to go that far. No signature. Poirot's eyes darkened. 2 letters, 2 secrets, and 1 unspoken confession. The mirrors were no longer just reflections. They were witnesses. Chapter 6. A letter. Before death, the following morning brought Renat, the gentle drizzle of English. Melancholy, but a steady needling storm that beat upon the window panes like a ticking clock. The entire house felt heavier under. The gray weight of the sky hallways echoed. Longer footsteps sounded softer. Hercule Poirot sat in the drawing room. A tray of toast and marmalade, untouched, before him. He did not eat. Hence, air grew tense. Instead, he studied. In his hand was the second letter, unsigned, done, finished, but pregnant with implication. If anything happens, know this, it wasn't meant to go that far. He had read the line a dozen times. Now he read it again. Handwriting was feminine, slanted, elegant, but hurried, not Miss Tilling's. Nutha's hand had urgency, panic. It had been hidden in the panel, along with Shonal sound admission. I kept the mirror room closed because of what it shows, and thin line that echoed with menace. I saw what Clarissa did. Poirot rose, and my day is way. To Saluno study a room. Few had entered since the old man's death. It smelled of cedar and something more. Metallic secrets clung to the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. As they whispered their contents into the ears of the unwary, he moved to the desk and began inspecting its drawers. Second from the bottom locked. Poirot withdrew a small pick from his pocket, delicate as a sewing needle. Within seconds, the lock clicked open. Inside was a bundle of documents, deeds, military correspondence, and at the very bottom, a torn envelope addressed to Miss J. Tilling. Inside a folded page, Joan. Igno, you still remember what happened in the mirror room? I know you've carried it all this time, but I must warn you, Clarissa is not as harmless as she seems. She threatened me when I tried to speak to Lionel about it. I'm afraid she does something again, something unforgivable. No name, no signature, but the handwriting matched. The second letter, in the wild Poirot's eyes, narrowed. Someone in this house had lived in fear of Clarissant. Now Joan Tilling was dead by noon. Pooh had summoned Clarissa once more. This time, he did not meet her in the study. He requested her presence in the mirror room. She arrived hesitantly, arms folded, her expression carefully masked. I must say, monsieur, she said, eyeing the cold mirrors, you developed quite the obsession with this dreadful room. No tap session, Poirot corrected gently. Curiosity. You see, mademoiselle, I believe this room holds the answer to everything. Clarissa smirked. Then perhaps the mirrors will tell you. They have already told me, Poirot said, his tone suddenly sharper. They told me about your red scarf, the one. The maid glimpsed before she screamed. Clarissa's eyes flashed. It wasn't mine. I've already said that, but it was, Poirot said calmly, and it was found this morning by one of the maids, shoved behind the paneling in the corridor, damp with rain, the very panel that opens onto This room, Clarissa's face palled. Pooh took a step closer. I also found the letter you wrote, warning Joan Tilling to keep silent. You were afraid, not for her, for yourself. I wrote, no sucking, she said quietly. Pooh ignored the lie. And now, Mademoiselle Tilling is dead in this room after the will was read, and she became a danger to you. Clarissa's mask cracked then. A flicker of something, fear, or perhaps fury. I never touched her, hissed. No, Poirot said, but I believe you confronted her. I believe Chethry Tant to expose something, and I believe you frightened her enough that she entered this room. On her own, perhaps. I'll leave behind a message, a warning. He held up the note she had written. Theon signed only with ink and fear. We all carry reflections, but some we should not see. Who quoted, tell me, what was she referring to? What does this room show that terrified her so? Clarissa didn't answer. Pooh tilted his head. Perhaps a truth long buried, a secret involving a man named Captain Thomas Rogg. Clarissa took an involuntary step back. Pooh's voice was soft now, almost gentle. Your Aunt Lady. Eugenia's younger sister was once engaged to him, was she not? But he was seen later with you. Clarissa looked away. It caused a scandal. Pooh continued it. When he was found dead, a so-called accident during training, Saluno covered it up. Miss Tilling was his secretary. She knew I was 16, Clarissa whispered. It wasn't what they thought. Pio's voice did not waver, but it was Sino to silence. Everyone enough for Sir Lionel to lock away this room, and now for you to be very afraid when Joan threatened to expose it. Now, Avtatha's will left you with less than you expected. Clarissa stared at the mirror. Her voice, when it came, was flat. I didn't kill her. Pooh said nothing. Clarissa turned and walked out without another word. That evening, Poirot sat in the dining room with Inspector Flint, the house wasquite, again, but not at peace. She's hiding something, Flint muttered. But you didn't think she'd killed the girl, do you? Poirot shook his head slowly. No, mademoiselle. Clarissa may be selfish, vain, and reckless, but not a murderer. Flint frowned then. Poirot's eyes drifted to the mirror on the wall, where the reflection of the empty hall shimmered vainly. That he said softly, is what we are about to find out. Chapter 7. The night the bell rang twice. The night after Poirot's confrontation with Clarissa Highmere Hall was restless. Ring continued to lash against the windows, and the trees outside danced like shadowy figures in a silent stir-waltz. Inside, the once grand manor seemed to shrink beneath the weight of secret shallways, felt longer. Every door creaked. Every mirror reflected something that didn't quite look right. Huot remained awake, fully dressed, seated by the fireplace in his room. A book lay open on his lap, but he hadn't turned a page in half an hour. Instead, he waited apacisely. 1:14 a.m. Sound broke the silence. A faint ting like metal on metal pews. Stood another ting louder. This time, then a sharp clang. He moved swiftly through the corridor, past the grandfather clock that had just finished its single chime, past the ancestral paintings that seemed to glare more than gaze, down the hall near the base of Duist wing stairs. It rang again. A silver bell. Not just any bell. The bell, the one missing from the vanity in the mirror room. Pooh stopped at the corridor's end, peering into the gloom. The light from his candle danced uneasily across the wallpaper. No one was there, but the bell rang once more. He followed the sound down the side hallway that led to the former servant quarters. A place long diseased. The floorboards groaned under his steps. Rain tapped the window panes like a creature trying to be let in. Pooh turned the final corner and froze at the far end of the hallway, lit only by the reflection of moonlight and varnished wood, sat the silver bell on the floor, perfectly centered. No hand had placed it. It lay there as if it had fallen or been dropped. He approached as he bent to retrieve it. A sound behind him, a scuffle, a door creaking open. Poirot turned a figure briefly, illuminated in a bolt of lightning through the window. Thin, tall, wearing dark clothing. The face was masked in shadow, but the posture unmistakably male. Stop. Pooh called out, but the figure fought back down the servant corridor and out of sight. Poirot gave chase, candle flickering wildly in his hand. He turned the corner and found nothing. No one Thackerayter was empty but one door. The door to the old butler's pantry now hung open inside. Nothing but shelves of dust, broken dishes, and a small, long, unused item waiter shaft in the wall. It was open rope ladder hanging down Poole Pyridine. The shaft descended to the cellar kitchens below. He smiled faintly. So, our mysterious night walker knows the house well. The next morning, Poole called a meeting. In the breakfast room, a rather uncharacteristic move. Everyone was present. Lady Eugenia, Peter Clarissa Montague, Marcus Finn, Agatha Cray, and Inspector Flint. The bell sat in the center of the table. Last night, Poirot said, this bell was heard ringing just after 1 o'clock. In the morning, it led me to the servant corridor, and a glimpse of someone who did not wish to be seen. Clarissa raised a brow. Someone trying to frighten you, perhaps, or mislead me. Pure plead. Inspector Flint cleared his throat. The dumb waiter shaft was disturbed. Someone used it. Peter looked alarmed. Why would anyone sneak around like that? We've got a killer in the house, for God's sake. Poirot's gaze flicked to Montague. Monsieur, you were entrusted with Salient's personal legal files. Did he ever mention installing hidden passages or servant tunnels not listed in the modern floor plans? Montague hesitated. Not in so many words, but he once told me. Hymere had layers like an onion. I assumed he meant the secrets. Poirot turned to Lady Eugenia. Madam, surely you know this house better than any of us. Have you ever used the passageways? Her lips pressed into a tight line. Not in decades. They were built during the Napoleonic years, hideaways for valuables, and at one time soldiers. Most are sealed now, but not all. Poirot said quietly. He looked at Marcus Vin, who had remained unusually silent through the conversation. You, Monsieur, Poirot said smoothly, are perhaps the most overlooked guest here. You arrived alone, Hive, few familial ties, and yet you know where the old passages lead. Marcus gave a tight smile. You flatter me, Poirot. I do not, Poirot said. I accuse you only of familiarity, not of murder. Marcus chuckled. Then what do you accuse me of? Bunk. Afraid the room went still. Poole continued. You are afraid that something you know or something you saw might now tie you to Miss Tilling's death, or will settle the incident long ago involving Captain Rogue. Marcus's face paled slightly, but he said nothing. Clarissa spoke up. What does this have to do with me? Everything, Poirot said, because the incident that Joan Tilling hinted at and that Lionel concealed revolves around your name, and someone here has been trying very hard to silence the past. Inspector Flint leaned in. So where does that leave us? Poole looked at him. It leaves us with one question, he said slowly, lifting the silver bell. Why was this taken from the mirror room, and why was it returned on the after Miss Tilling died? No one answered. P's voice dropped to a whisper bass. Whoever took it needed time to clean off the fingerprints. That night Poirot sat alone in the library, reading the final letter from Sir Lionel's private files. It was addressed to Gerald Montague. If anything should happen, destroy the letters, especially the one Joan copied. If you fail, the mirror room will become a vault, not for secrets, but for guilt, and guilt, Gerald, is louder than truth. Poole leaned back in his chair and smiled, because now he music knew. Chapter 8. The Guilty Reflections. Next day dawned brighter, the rain gone, but the sunlight that filtered into Hymere Hall seemed wrong to sharp twinkling, like a cruel spotlight illuminating a stage long soaked in shadows. The hallways still whispered, the mirrors still watched, but the mood had changed. Someone in the house was losing control, and Hercule could feel it. He moved with calm precision through the manor, stopping briefly at the base of the main staircase. There, on a silver tray beside the morning post, lay a single object out of place, a compact mirror, small, circular, gilded at the edges, but cracked, a perfect web of glass, frozen mid-shatter. He lifted it gently. then looked up toward the landing above, where Clarissa Edgecombe had just appeared in her dressing gown, eyes bloodshot, lips pressed tight. She saw what he held, her breath caught. "Yours, mademoiselle." Quist. Clarissa's voice was barely audible. "It was in my purse. I must have dropped it." Cool nodded, pocketing the mirror. "Strange, is it not, how everything here seems to fall, break, shatter?" She said nothing and disappeared out the corridor. Pua didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, he turned and walked to the drawing room, where he found Peter Edgecombe and Marcus Van conversation. They stopped when he entered. "Gentlemen," Poirot said, "you will forgive me for interrupting. I must ask a difficult question." Peter shifted in his chair. "Another one." Puyo ignored Hyman, looked at Marcus. "You fought with Captain Rogue, did you not?" Marcus blinked. "What? You were in the same regiment, Sussex 1917. You were not merely a business partner. To Shono, you were his wartime confidant." Marcus stood slowly. "How do Yak know then?" I asked. "Hastings to send me a list of unit rosters. Your name appears by Rajkeys in several records. You both served together, yet you never mentioned it." Peter frowned. "Why wouldn't you tell us that?" Marcus' jaw tightened. "Bex, I didn't think it was relevant." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "But it is." He moved closer. "Captain Rogue did not die by accident, did he?" Marcus didn't speak. Poirot continued. "Sir Lionel knew. That is why he covered it. That is why he locked its mirror room. Rogue's death was not a battlefield tragedy. It was a personal one. Something happened between him and Clarissa. Something that made Sir Lionel hide the truth, and Joe and Tilling swear to carry it." Peter sat forward, visibly sweating. "Now, wait, are you saying Clarissa killed him?" Pooh shook his head. "No, I am saying someone else did." The room fell still. Poirot looked at Marcus. "You," he said softly, "you killed Captain Rogue." Marcus laughed, but the sound cracked in his throat. "That's absurd." Pause. "Unrelenting, you were in love with Clarissa. Even then, you saw her with Rogue, saw her heart slipping away from you." Marcus's voice sharpened. "She was a child, barely 16. But you were not." Poole replied. "You were older and jealous. You thought yourself a protector, but what you felt was obsession. And when you saw Rogue with her, I warned him." Marcus snapped. "I told him if he didn't end it, if he hurt her." Poole didn't blink. "So Yao stitched an accident during training. No one asked questions. War was. Caddick Surly and all suspected, but kept it buried to protect the family name." Joan Tilling found the letters. She knew. She stayed silent until now. Peter stood, reeling. "My God." Pew turned to him. She was going to expose the truth. That's why Marcus confronted her in the mirror room. That's why the bell was removed. That's why he used the dumb waiter shaft to escape, not knowing that the maid had seen a flash of red scarf through the window, but the scarf belonged to Clarissa. "Peter," said Pua, smiled faintly. "We, and that monsieur was Sire's salvation, for it gave the killer just enough cover to slip through unnoticed." Marcus stepped back, his face fully composed, twisted with panic. "You can't prove I killed her," he muttered. "You have no weapon, no witness." Corey yacked into his pocket and withdrew the cracked compact mirror. "No," he said quietly, "but Miss Tilling left this with your fingerprints still etched in powder along its edge. You gave it to her, didn't you, during the confrontation, perhaps, and threatened her with it. But in the struggle, a cracked flint entered Frantal, his presence, like a heavy curtain falling over the room. I believe it's it." "Enough," the inspector said. Marcus didn't run. He simply lowered himself into the chair, face blank, as though the wit of 20 years had finally crushed him. "She was going to ruin everything," he said softly. "She had no right." Kiro tilted his head. "She had the right to truth, and now, Monsieur, the mirrors will reflect only what remains." Later that night, Poirot stood alone in the mirror room. The candlelight flickered across the fractured surfaces. He moved to the Kyle mirror and stared into it. His reflection stared back, neat, upright, still, but behind him only stillness. He smiled sadly. "All crimes leave shadows," Hammer murmured, "but it is not the shadow that convicts. It is the mirror that shows us who we are. And with that, Hercule quietly turned out the light. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The morning after Marcus Vivens' quiet confession, Mayor Hall was silent in a different way. Not the tense silence of suspicion, but the hollow hush that follows revelation. It was the kind of quiet left behind when lies have been ripped from the walls and truths left bleeding on the floor. But Hercule Poirot was not yet satisfied. Something he believed was still missing, though Marcus had admitted to silencing Captain Rogue during the war and had very likely confronted Joan Tilling in the mirror room. Poirot's instinct whispered that the full story had not yet surfaced, and when Hercule Poirot's instincts whispered, he listened. In the late morning, Poirot sought out Inspector Flint in the library. "Mr. Flint," Poirot began, "Marcus Finn may be guilty of many things: of jealousy, of concealing the truth, of fearing John Tilling's knowledge, but Hayes not, I think, the one who murdered her." Flint raised an eyebrow. "You're not convinced by his confession?" "Oh, I am convinced he believed he was responsible," Poirot said softly. "But he is a man who confesses when guilt presses upon him, not necessarily when evidence is meant. There is a distinction." He placed a cracked, compact mirror gently on the table. "This was not a weapon," Poole continued, "nor was it used in any attack. It was dropped clutched in fear, a message, and the real murderer let Caustica the blame because it was convenient." Flint frowned. Then Poirot's eyes darkened slightly. "That, sir, is what I intend to discover, but to do so must invite the suspects into the light, all of them." He turned to the door. "This time," he said, "for the trap." That evening, as the lamps were lit, the long corridors filled with flickering warmth, the guests were invited into the drawing room. Once more this time, however, it was Poole who stood at the hearth. The silver bell was on the mantel. The cracked mirror lay upon the side table. The letters, now neatly stacked and bound, were in P's hands. "I thank you all for coming," he said with formality, eyes scanning the room. "There has been much confusion, much darkness, but it is time for clarity." Lady Eugenia sat rigidly, hands clasped. Peter looked worn and pale, a glass of brandy untouched in front of him. Clarissa lounged in a corner, but her gaze was sharper than ever. Montague remained. Neath curtains, the shadows cloaking half his face, Poole held up the letters. These side documents were hidden behind a panel in the mirror room. One is a confession from Sir Lionel himself, acknowledging as scandal buried deep in the family's past. Another is an unsigned warning to Miss Joan Tilling. And then this. He lifted the third eye, saw what Clarissa did, and I, Farah Joan speaks. It will all unravel. Poirot paused. "I originally assumed this was written by Marcus Sven, but it was not." Clarissa tensed. "Poor turned it was written by you, Mr. Montague." A collective intake of breath. "Montague froze. You weareth only one with access to the mirror room key," Poirot continued. "You were entrusted with Sir Lionel's final instructions. You were the solicitor, but you were also the gatekeeper. And Joan Tilling knew too much." Montague swallowed hard. "I tried to keep things orderly. You tried to keep things hidden." Poole corrected. "You were afraid that if John exposed the truth about Rogue, about Thwill, about the mirror room, your reputation would collapse alongside the Edgecombe legacy." Montague's voice was keyed. "Now, I only wanted to protect the family." Poole's voice, however, remained firm. "Now, sir, you wanted to protect yourself. You helped craft the will. You knew Clarissa would be dissatisfied. You feared her reaction, but it was Joan Hope threatened to speak, and so you silenced her neatly, quietly, without blood." Peter stood, shocked. "But how?" Poole nodded to the inspector, who stepped forward with a small glass vial. "Belladonna." Flint said, grimly traced to a bottle in Montague's bag. Poirot continued. "You offered her tea in the drawing room that night. Just a short conversation. You said she drank from your cup, and hours later she washed it in front of the mirror." Clarissa looked horrified. You killed her for what?" Old letters. Montague finally collapsed into a chair, face pale and eyes sunken. "She said she'd go to the press." he whispered. She wanted the world to know what Sir Lionel had done, what Telaview had done. I couldn't let that happen. Pooh turned to the group. The truth always finds its reflection, and in a house full of mirrors, there is no place for it to hide. The following morning, Montague was taken away by the local constables. The hall was quieter, still wounded, but beginning to breathe. King Clarissa, for the first time, did not wear perfume. Peter walked in the garden's holders. Lighter Lady Eugenia retreated to her chambers with a silence that felt almost peaceful. And Hercule Poirot, he stood in the mirror room. One final time, he looked into the Kyle glass, his reflection framed by cracked light and solemn shadows. Then he bowed to a justice. She is never elegant, but she is precise. He smiled faintly and walked away. Chapter 10. The Final Reflection. The storm had passed. Both in sky and Soul High Hall stood beneath a cold morning sun, its stone walls scrubbed by days of rain, its secrets finally aired. The gravel driveway sparkled faintly with moisture and Thelon's long unwalked. Now bore fresh footprints, not of secrets fleeing, but of burdens, leaving quietly inside the halls where still breakfast had been taken in silence. There was no need for words. What true maid could not be spoken aloud. Pooh stood once more in the great entrance hall, his gloved hands clasped neatly behind his back, his travel case already resting inside the door. Inspector Flint had departed, early escorting Montague into the hands of the local magistrates. The Edgecombes, each in their way, had vanished to their respective corners of retreat. Peter to the library, Clarissa to the Gordon path, Lady Eugenia to her solarium, and Silence. All of them were in their own way survivors, but survival was rarely clean. Clarissa approached quietly from stairwell, wearing a long gray coat and a face that seemed older than it had days before your leaving. Then, she said, folding her arms. Pooh turned to her and offered a small, polite nod. When Mademoiselle, my work here is complete. The truth has emerged, as it always does eventually. Clarissa studied him. And what do you think of us now? The Edgecombes, tainted legacy, and Alpioro's smile was gentle. Madame, every family is a mirror. Some are cracked, others merely dusty, but even broken glass shows the truth if one dares to look. She looked down. You could have exposed me more than you did. He tilted his head. Mademoiselle, your sins were sins of silence, of youthful confusion. But you did not kill, nor did you scheme to destroy. You are guilty. Yes, of not speaking when it would have mattered most. Clarissa met his gaze, and will that damn me Pugh's eyes softened. That is not for me to say. Say it is for your mirror. She gave a small, almost trembling smile, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading softly into the long corridor of her family's history. Later that afternoon, Poirot visited the mirror room. One last time, he stood in the center, surrounded by hundreds of reflections, all fractional, slightly different. The glass didn't just return his image, it distorted it, offered it in shards, insolence, in strange proportions. But he didn't flinch. He admired it. In one mirror, he looked taller. In another, sadder one gave him a cruel, Mathanather eyes, too large, all of them, me. He said quietly, and none of them from his coat pocket. He withdrew the final letter Sir Lionel had written, but never sent addressed. Not to Joan Tilling, nor to Montague, but to himself, to the man who sees what others miss. If you were reading this, Dan, I have failed to silence the past, but perhaps will succeed in giving it form. The mirror room is not a prison, it is a truth teller, and truth is all I have left to leave behind. Poirot folded it, placed it gently back in the drawer off the vanity where Joan Tilling had sat for the last time, and closed it. Soft, lino, grand speeches, no ceremony, just quiet. Closure at the gates of Highmere Hall. His car waited. The butler placed his suitcase in the boot. Poirot turned one last time to look up at the manor, its windows shining faintly in the pale sun like the very mirrors it had once locked away. Peter Edgecombe came down the steps. Poirot, he said, slightly breathlessly. I wanted to say thank you. Pooh extended a gloved hand, which Peter shook too tightly, as men do when they don't know what to say. "I never really knew what kind of man my grandfather was," Peter said. "But I think now I'm starting to understand." Rose smiled. "Then the mirror room has served its purpose." Peter paused, brow furrowed. "Will you ever come back here?" Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "No, some places are best left behind once their truths are revealed." He stepped into the car, offered a final tip of the hat, and as the engine purred to life and the gravel crunched beneath the wheels, Hercule Poirot left Manor Hall behind him, a house no longer haunted. Before him, the road straight, silent, and gleaming. With possibility mirrors, they do not lie, he murmured to himself in the back seat. It is only the eyes that choose not to see. And with that he closed his eyes. The case of the locked mirror room had ended, but their gray cells, they never sleep. Chapter 11. The reflection that remains. It was nearly a week after his departure from Manor Hall when Hercule Poirot sat once again in his apartment on Whitehaven Mansions, sipping chamomile and gazing through the window onto the quiet street below the London. Air was crisp. A single pigeon stood on the railing outside, as if listening. He did not speak of the Edgecombe case to visitors, not to Hastings, nor to Miss Lemon, nor even to Inspector. But one afternoon, as the sunlight cast long, golden shadows across the park floor, Poirot reached for his notebook, not to log evidence, but to reflect not on facts, but on people. The curious thing, he wrote in his neat, slanted script, is that the Cassiaf, the locked mirror room, was never about one death. It was about all the reflections that came before it. And the reflections, people could not bear to see. Miss Joan Tilling had not died because of revenge or greed or violence in the usual sense. She had died because the truth buried too long had become dangerous in too many directions. Salino, long since buried, had created the mirror room not to hide secrets. Buteau reminded himself of them. He had locked away not just a space, but a memory of a soldier who died under suspicious circumstances, of a granddaughter's youthful entanglement, of letters that could unmake a family's reputation. People do not fear the mirror, Poirot wrote. They fear the moment when they must finally look into it. Clarissa Vane, proud but not cruel, had carried the weight of what never was a relationship, misunderstood, a scandal exaggerated, a past sealed like a wound. Her real punishment was not legal, it was personal. She had to live with that knowledge that her silence had allowed guilt to ferment in others. Peter Edgecombe, passive and pliable, had emerged perhaps the most changed in the days after the arrests. Poirot had received a letter from him, a short nod. "Thank you for reminding me that truth isn't always easy, but it's always necessary." Lady Eugenia remained silent. Poirot did not expect otherwise, but what lingered most, even in the quiet of his London home, was the image of the mirror room, that solemn, reflective space filled with fractured truths. It had not merely served as the crime scene, it had been the simple, off case, the chamber where no one could hide from themselves. Quill closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. He glanced at his own reflection in the gleaming teapot on the tray beside him, slightly distorted of course, but still handsome. He sat with a smile. Late at that evening, he lit a single candle in the corner of his drawing room, a small ritual he performed after particular tragic cases. He let the silence fall around him like a shroud and watched the theft flame flicker, not in mourning, but in respect. Respect for Joan Tilling, who had tried to do right. Respect for Salino, who had buried his shame in wood and glass. And respect for the truth, which, like Poirot himself, could not be fooled forever. In the end, he whispered to himself, the mirrors do not kill but they always tell. He blew out the candle and the reflection faded into the dark. Chapter 12. Echoes in the glass. 2 days after Antigue's arrest, peace returned to Manor Hall, but only on the surface beneath it. Shadows lingered, like smoke, clinging to the walls. The house no longer echoed with crisp polish of silver trays or polite murmurs over tea. Instead, I texted something emptier, unresolved truths. Poirot had remained at the estate longer than expected, citing his fondness for Devonshire air and truth. He had not left because something still bothered him. It itched at the edge of his thoughts, like a word one cannot quit or recall in the library. He reread the letters in the mirror room. He studied Dangle's Edge's reflections in his own mind. The puzzle was not yet whole. He met with Clarissa one morning on the east lawn. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, only a wool shawl and a look of Quietex Houston. "Did you love him?" Poirot asked without preamble. Clarissa didn't pretend to misunderstand. "No," she said. "I was flattered. I was 16. He was older, handsome, a dangerous sort of way. He made me feel seen." "And your aunt?" Clarissa sighed. "She hated the thought of me being entangled in anything improper," she told him. Lionel, and I suppose that was the end of it." Poirot nodded, and yet Youde defended him too. Joan, years later, when she began to ask questions. Clara saddened sharply. "You read the letters, didn't you, Poirot?" Didn't answer. "Yes," she said, her voice low. "I told Joan she was wrong, that she misunderstood what happened between me and Captain Roebuck. Never believed me. I think she believed I was hiding." Something turned his gaze toward the distant trees. "Perhaps," he murmured, "you both were at that meeting Poirot invited Peter to walk the grounds with him." The mist was low anting lanterns along the garden path flickered in the breeze. "I had been thinking," Poirot said softly, "off reflections." Peter chuckled weakly. "You and your mirrors. No Manami, not the glass. People, the way they reflect one another." Peter frowned. "I don't follow." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Your grandfather feared shame. Your sister feared truth. Your solicitor feared disgrace. And Joan, she feared regret. But you, Mr. Peter, you fear failure." Peter stopped walking. "I failed at everything," he said, flatly. "Business, family. I drank away my inheritance long before I ever received it." Placed a hunchingly on his shoulder. "And yet you remained here through the readings, the tension, the investigation. You never left." Peter stared ahead. "Because I thought maybe this time I could make Sim a thing, right?" Back in his guest room, Poirot reviewed his notes one last time for bed. Something still didn't sit right. Not with Antigue's timeline, not with Joan's letter, and certainly not with the mirror room he opened. The sketch he'd drawn, a crude map of their room's layout. The mirrors, the vanity, the shield mirror, the faint panel in Thefler, the floor. Poirot sat up straight. He turned to a suitcase, retrieved his walking stick, not because he needed it, but because it had a hollow handle where he stored a narrow-bladed screwdriver. Minutes later, he stood once again in the mirror room, candle in hand, eyes glittering with focus. He tapped the floorboard beneath the Kahal. Mirror hollow, gently, precisely. He pried it open inside a small, cloth-bound notebook, dusty forgotten. He opened it. The pages were written in a careful, feminine hand. The initials at the bottom of the first page made him stop cold. A.E. Lady Agatha Eugenia. Craig, Clarice's cousin, the one who had laughed too much, smiled tooishly, and always seemed just slightly too interested in everything that didn't involve her. Poirot sat on the stool, Nerth Vanity, and read slowly, thoroughly. The final entry was dated 4 days before Joan Tilling's death. "She knows. Joan, the way she looks at me, it's not curiosity anymore. It's certainty. I thought it was. Lionel who locked the mirror room all those years ago, but it wasn't. It was me, bro." Closed the book. The reflection had finally spoken, but it wasn't the one he expected. Chapter 13. The woman behind the mirror. The following morning, the house awoke to rare calm, a deceptive calm, the kind that comes before the ground gives way. Breakfast was served, but barely touched. The servants moved quietly, as if mimicking the hush that had spread through the walls of Higher Hall. Hercule Poirot did not attend breakfast. He was already seated in the drawing room, the small notebook recovered from beneath the mirror room floor, resting gently in his lap. He had read it twice before dawn. Now he read Ida third time. Not because he doubted what it said, but because he was preparing for what must come next at precisely 10. Ma'am summoned Lady Agatha Cray. She entered with her usual theatrical flair, a silk scarf tied around her throat, her perfume preceding her by a breath and a half. But Poirot saw what others did not, the tightness behind her smile, the sudden avoidance of his eyes. "You summoned me, monsieur?" she said lightly. "Do I need a lawyer or just a new lipstick?" Boom offered a faint smile. "Said Madame, we must speak not of cosmetics, but of conscience." She sat slowly and crossed one leg over the other with elegance that seemed practiced rather than natural. Poole held up the small notebook. "Do you recognize this?" Her face changed in the subtlest way. A millisecond pause. "Okay." Blinked slightly, too long a tightening of the fingers around the chair's carved armrest. "No," she said. "It was found beneath the floorboards of the mirror room." Poirot continued, his voice calm, tucked in a hollow space that had not been touched in years. "And yet the last entry is recent, dated 4 days before Miss Tilling's death." Agatha said nothing but stood, pacing slowly in it. The writer speaks of fear, of guilt, and of knowledge set. Joan Tilling had uncovered something, not about the past scandal, not about Captain Rogue, but something else. Something older, deeper. He turned to face her. "Shall I read the entry aloud?" Agatha axled. "No need." Her voice was quieter now, but steadier than Poirot expected. "She confronted me," Agatha said. "Joan, 2 days before the will was read, she came to my room, asked me what happened in the mirror room in 1909. I told her I didn't remember." Pooh tilted his head. "But you did remember?" "Yes." Agatha admitted every detail. Her eyes were no longer evasive. They stared straight ahead, and blinking. "I was 17. Jonathan Edgecombe, Lionel's younger brother, was infatuated with me. It was innocent at first, flattery gifts, but then he'd become a strange possessive. He began following me at night, whispering things to the mirrors." Pooh sat again, listening intently. "One evening," Agatha continued, "he cornered him in that room, tried to kiss me. I pushed him. He hit his head, not badly, untangle. To scare him, he began to weep violently. Then he screamed at me, said he'd ruined him, that he'd ended all. The next morning, he was found hanging in that very room." P's voice was soft. "And you never told anyone?" "I told Lionel," Agatha said, her voice trembling. "Now he sealed the room, said it was Jonathan's shame, not mine. He wanted to protect the family." Name Poirot's brow furrowed. "But you lived with the guilt?" "Yes," she whispered. "For decades." Poirot leaned forward. "Then tell me this. When Joan confronted you, what did you say?" "I told her she had no proof," Agatha said, pretty audible. "She said she didn't need any, that she would reveal everything after the will reading, that the family had lied too long behind glass." Pooh stared at her. "Did you kill her?" Agatha looked him directly in the eye. "No," she said, and Poirot believed her, but there was something else, some final hesitation, something unsaid. "She died before she could reveal what she knew," Poirot said, "and someone used that truth, your truth, to cover another crime." Agatha's voice trembled. "You think Montague?" Poirot sage, standing again. "I no longer believe Montague acted alone." Walked to the window, drawing back the curtain. The reflection in the glass shimmered, and in it he saw the faint outline of Peter Edgecombe, watching from the garden, motionless. Poole turned back to Agatha. "There is more to this story," he said, "and if we do not uncover it, soon someone else may die that night." Poole remained in the mirror room long past midnight. The candles cast long shadows. He sat in the center, the cowl mirror. Before him, Joan Tilling's cracked compact in his hand. He opined it and stared into its broken reflection and saw something he had missed before. A fingerprint, faint, incomplete, on the inner rim. Not Montague's, not Agatha's. Hick. The time, 10:06 a.m. Outside wind stirred the hedge. Somewhere in the hollow floorboard creaked. Poirot stood. He had seen enough. The reflection had spoken again, and this time he knew who killed. It's Joan Tilling. Chapter 14. A murder in the mind. The next morning broke cold and clear. Asif The storm had spent itself on every part of the estate, but the hearts within it inside. Higher hall, the air remained heavy with silence, with secrets, and with the knowledge that someone among them had taken a life under the guise of preserving. Another pool, dressed with meticulous care. His tie was perfectly symmetric, his cuffs gently starched, and his mustache as ever immaculate but beneath the surface. His mind moved with lightning clarity. He had spent the early hours not sleeping, but reconstructing. Now, in the solitude of the library, he began to speak. His thoughts allowed not to another person, but to the room itself, to the echoes, to the evidence. "Let us begin," he said softly, pacing before the fire. "We have a death." "Quiet one, Miss Joan." Tilling loyal secretary found lifeless before a shattered mirror. With no sign of struggle, no weapon, and no sound heard, it was assumed to be poison, but no vial was found, no teacup, no food in the note, save the cryptic lines she left behind. He glanced at the notebook in his hand. "We all carry reflections, but some we should not see." Poirot paused, then continued. Montague was convenient too. Convenient, he had access, yes, but Motivwig, he feared disgrace her. True, but he also feared Lady Eugenia, and fear, mon ami, makes for caution, not murder. He turned to the sketch he had drawn of the room. Angles, mirrors, the placement of the vanity, the shifting light. Then he tapped his finger against a small circle. He had drawn the position where the compact mirror had been found, just below thus tool. She dropped it. Poole whispered in fear, in shock, or in sudden realization, walked to the window where the garden was beginning to bloom with the faintest signs of spring. "And then there is Agatha Gray," he continued, "guilt from the past. Certainly, but not motive enough. Her secret was buried. It would have died with her, she feared." Joan's questions, but not Joan herself, he returned to the desk. "Then who benefits most from Joan's silence?" He stopped, stared into the fireplace, and whispered the name Peter. Later that day, Poole sat with Peter in the conservatory. Bright, echoing space with long windows and faded orchids. Peter appeared, better rested, his eyes clearing, his posture more confident. It struck Poirot immediately. "A walk before breakfast?" Poole asked. Pleasantly, Peter shrugged. "Habit clears the head." "Indeed," Poirot said. "I find it also clarifies motive." Peter blinked. "Pardon," Poirot did not reply. "Immediate tell me, monsieur," he said. "Why did you return to Hymir Hall after so long away?" Peter smiled faintly. "The will, of course, and family." Poole looked at him, calm, evenly. "You were nearly written out of it, were you not?" Sir Lionel changed his mind only months before his death. Clarissa was meant to inherit everything. Peter's eyes narrowed. "I didn't ask for anything, but you needed it," Poirot said gently. "Gambling debts, failed ventures, 2 lawsuits in the past year. Shall I go on?" Peter said. Nothing. Joan Tilling, Poirot conscient, knew that the will had been altered, and she knew why, because she had persuaded Sir Lionel to reinstate you. Peter's brow creased. "That's not true about." "It is," was said. "And do you know why she did it?" Peter shook his head. Slowly Poirot leaned in. "Because she pied you, because she saw something in you that reminded her of herself, tired, disappointed, drifting. But she also knew, too, much about the mirror room, about Agatha, about Rogue, and about your anger when you learned that Clarissa had once been promised everything." Peter flinched. Poirot's slowly. "You didn't plan to kill her, not at first. You simply wanted to frighten her, to silence her, perhaps to steal back a letter or destroy a paper." Was she surprised? "You fought back, and in that moment, you lost control." Peter stood now too defensive. "It's not with a pand." Poole did not move. "You used belladonna. You slipped it into her teeth at night while she waited in the drawing room. You knew Montague would be blamed, the perfect scapegoat. He had motive. He had access. He had the history. You only needed to place the bell where right would be found." Peter's face twisted. She was going to take it all away. "From after everything I lost," Poirot's voice was low. "She gave you everything, monsieur, not out of obligation, but compassion, and you destroyed her for it. Peter stepped back. Poirot's voice was calm now. There are mirrors, Peter, Anthony. There are windows and shows us what we are. The other shows us what we could become. You chose the wrong one. A knock at the glass doors behind them. Inspector Flint. 2 constables stood at his side at night. Poirot remained seated in the drawing room long after the others had gone to bed. He watched the fire slowly burn down, and he murmured into the silence, in the end, the mirror did not leave only the man who stood for it. Chapter 15. The mirror shatters the morning following. Peter Edgecombe's arrest was bitterly cold. Even the bright rays of the sun seemed hesitant to penetrate the thick fog hanging over Highmere Hall. The estate, once an impressive monument to the Edgecombe legacy, now stood as a quiet reminder of his secrets that had unraveled within its walls. Inside, Hercule Poirot made his final preparations. The house had been thoroughly searched. The necessary documents were in order. The investigation was nearing its inevitable conclusion, and yet Poirot could feel that there was still one final question to answer, one final deception to uncover. At precisely 11, Cagayan Poirot called for one last meeting. Lady Eugenia Clarissa, Agatha, and Flint were gathered in the library. Peter had been taken to a nearby holding facility, awaiting formal charges. Their room was lit by soft daylight, but the atmosphere remained tense, as though Vivian instinctively knew the final act was near. Pooh stood before them, calm, collected, and unreadable. He watched them carefully, eyes flicking between faces. He opened the floor with a single deliberate question. Who among you knew about Peter's gambling debts? Clarissa's eyes widened for a brief moment before she regained her composure. What does that have to do with anything? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Everything you see, mademoiselle. It is not simply the motive for the crime that matters, but the psychological layers beneath it. Peter's desperation drove him, yes, but it was the other motivations that led to his actions. Are you suggesting he acted alone? Flint asked, his brow furrowed. Poirot's smile was tight like a wire drawn to taut no more. Peter acted on his own, but he did not act out of nothing. He was influenced, guided by Simeon, who understood his weaknesses. Pooh turned to Agatha, whose eyes flicked to the floor. He said quietly, you guided him. Agatha's face palled. She opened her mouth to speak, but paused, as though weighing her words carefully. I don't. Now, what you mean? Pooh stepped closer. You knew about Kita's debts. You knew how badly he needed money, how desperate he had become after Sayonel's death, and the reduction of his inheritance. You watched him spiral, and you watched his anger grow, especially toward Clarissa. He turned toward Clarissa. It is true, is it not, that Peter's inheritance was primarily tied to his relationship with Sir Lionel. When that relationship was altered, he had nothing to fall back on but the bitter remnants of what was once promised to him. Clarissa nodded, but said nothing. Poirot turned back to Agatha. You feared this? You feared what Peter would do once his desperation reached its peak, and so you gave him way out, not in kindness, but in manipulation. You suggested he take drastic action. You convinced him that Joan Tillon was the key to restoring his fortune. I's eyes darted toward the door, as if contemplating escape. You see, Poirot continued, his voice calm but forceful. Joan was no longer useful to your plans. She was going to expose the truth. She was the one who would have destroyed Peter's final chance at reclaiming the wealth that had slipped through his fingers. And so you manipulated Peter into killing her, and not directly, but through your influence. Agatha's lips trembled, and she closed her eyes. No, she whispered. I didn't want this. I didn't want him to kill her. Pooh nodded, his gaze steady. But you allowed him to believe it was his only option. You allowed him to believe that in eliminating Joan, his debts would vanish, that his future could be bought back. Agatha sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I never thought it would go this far. Poirot's voice softened thought. His words were still sharp. You did not need to think it would go fairy. only needed to guide him, to give him the justification for his actions. And you did. The truth was never about the will or the inheritance. The truth weighs about what you were willing to allow to happen to protect your own legacy. Agatha buried her face in her hands. I didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't bear it. Poirot's eyes softened, but he did not move your fear. Madame Cray was never about guilt. It was about control. Feared losing control over Peter, over the secrets you shared over Thepawar. You thought you still held. He turned toward the others. In the room, Peter killed Joan Tilling. Yes, but it was not out of hatred. It was out of desperation, a desperation he did not recognize until it was too late. The murder itself was simple, but the psychological construct that led him there, that was far more complex. Lady Genia's voice, weak and uncertain, broke. The silence. You were manipulating him, she said softly. You led him to believe this was the only way. Agatha, no dead but, did not meet her eyes. Pooh straightened now, Madame Cray. He said, his voice steady. It is time for the truth to be reflected fully. No more shadows. The room was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire Poirot turned toward, the door signaling that the meeting was over. I will leave you now, he said. The final decision is yours to make. He paused, then added, however, I do ask that you look into the mirror one last time, for in it you will see not only the reflection of what you have done, but what you could have been. Later that evening, Poirot departed High Mare. His task complete, the sun had begun toasted, casting long shadows over the estate. High Mare Hall, once a symbol of family pride, now stood as a quiet reminder of Calpe, reminder of the truth that had been revealed. Poe stood at the gate one last time, glancing over his shoulder. He could still see their reflection of the estate in the glass, and for the first time in many days, he felt at peace. Chapter 16, the last reflection. The road out of High Mare Hall was winding and long, flanked by tall hedges that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Hercule Poirot sat in the back of the carriage, his eyes distant as he looked out over the landscape. It was a quiet sort of journey, one that mirrored the peace he had come to know after every case, the calm that followed the storm of revelation. The house had been cleared of its guilt. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and disjointed, now lay neatly together, and the truth had been exposed in all its cold clarity. The secrets of High Mare Hall were now just history written in ink and sealed in the shadows. Yet, even now, as the estate disappeared behind him, Poirot knew there was something more to be understood. The following day, Poirot sat alone in his London apartment, sipping tea by the fire. His mind had already moved on to the next case, to the next puzzle, but there was still a quiet echo in his thoughts, a lingering question. He sat back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the teacup, and allowed himself a moment to reflect. The truth, he thought, was a curious thing. It was not always loud, nor was it always sharp. Often the truth was silent. It was patient. It waited for its moment, for the right eye, the right mind to notice it, and when it was finally seen, it did not need to shout. It simply was, and in that quiet, certain, ear thing was fell away. In the case of High Mare Hall, it had not been Montague who had been the most dangerous, nor had it been Agatha. No, the most dangerous were those who watched from the shadows, those who kept their reflections hidden, even from themselves. Peter had killed because he believed in survival at any cost. He had seen his reflection in the mirror and believed it to be his only future, a future built on lies and desperation. His motive had been simple, but it was laced with a deeper flaw, a belief that he could outrun the consequences of his actions. And then there was Agatha. Agatha had feared the past and feared the truth more than anything else. She had buried it under the weight of silence, believing that by controlling the narrative, Hercule erased the stain, but in doing so, she had become a prisoner of her own. Hercule, making Clarissa to have her reflections. She had seen herself in the mirror a woman defined by beauty and privilege, but also a woman lost in a life of shallow distractions. She had avoided the truth until it was too late, and then, when it was revealed, she had found herself on the edge of the same abyss that had consumed her family. But Poirot had also seen something else, something that had not been reflected in the mirrors of High Hall, the human heart. Poirot knew was capable of great complexities. There was no simple answer to the question of why people acted as they did. It was easy to look at someone and assume they were motivated by greed, by revenge, by jealousy. But in his years of experience, Poirot had come to understand that the human mind was rarely so clear-cut. People did not kill for one reason. They did not lie or deceive because of a single motive. Instead, it was a tangled web of fears, desires, regrets, and broken dreams. And in the case of Hymare, Hall's mirror room had reflected every single one of those complexities. The house itself, in its own way, had become a mirror, a place that held the truths of those who entered it, a place that reflected their inner turmoil, their guilt, and their need for redemption. It was a room built on secrets, and yet, in the end, it had served its true purpose to reveal the truth. Pooh smiled softly to himself. Yes, yes, he murmured, a reflection, always a reflection later, that Evan Ingus. The last of the twilight faded into darkness. Poirot stood in front of his apartment window, looking out over the street below. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, neat, controlled, exact. But as he looked closer, saw something more. The reflection was a little too perfect, a little too sharpened. He knew in that moment that even his own reflection, though carefully composite, held its own secrets, perhaps not of guilt, but of a life lived with precision, of a mind that was constantly at work. He smiled again, this time with a touch of more even. "I," he whispered, "cannot escape the truth of the mirror." Poole turned away from the window and made his way to the door. He had Danathor case to attend to another mystery, to solve another reflection takeover for Hercule Poirot. The search for truth was never over. It was only ever reflected.